The door was locked from the inside. That was the first thing Peter Klaus noticed when he arrived at the house on Wollestraat Street on the morning of December 4th, 1301. Not the cold, not the silence, not the absence of any sound from within a house that should have been waking up with the rest of the city. The first thing he noticed was the door. The iron bolt had been thrown shut from the inside, and there was no way to open it from where he stood. He knocked twice. He called out. Nothing answered him but the wind coming off the canal. He had been a city guard for 29 years. He knew what it meant when a house did not answer in the morning. It took 4 men and a heavy wooden beam to bring the door down. The hinges gave before the lock did. When they finally pushed through into the entrance hall, and the cold hit them first, the kind of cold that settles into a room when there has been no fire and no breath in it for many hours. The candles on the writing table had burned down to nothing. The wax pooled and hardened on the wood. And on the stone floor, face down, with one arm stretched toward the door, as though reaching for something he never found, was Willem van Houte, one of the most respected cloth merchants in all of Bruges, lying in a pool of his own blood that had long since gone dark and cold. Nobody had broken in, nobody had broken out, and yet someone had killed him. Peter Klaus stood in that doorway for a long moment before he stepped inside. 29 years had taught him to look before he moved, to read a room before he changed it. He looked at the overturned inkpot on the writing table. He looked at the wine cup, still half full, undisturbed, as though Willem had set it down gently before falling. He looked at the single window, shuttered and latched from within. He looked at the back passage door, closed and bolted. He looked at the floor around the body, at the absence of any drag marks, at the position of the arm, at the way a man falls when he does not expect to fall. Then he looked at something near the back passage door that caught the thin winter light coming through the broken entrance behind him. Something small. Something that should not have been there. He noted it, he wrote it down, and then, for reasons that would not become clear for 3 decades, he forgot about it entirely. But we will come back to that. First, you need to understand who Willem van Houte was. Not the merchant, and not the guild councillor, not the respected name that every cloth trader in Flanders knew. You need to understand the man behind all of that, because this case, like most cases, was not really about a crime at all. It was about what a person becomes when the distance between who they are and who everyone thinks they are grows too large to hold. Willem van Houte was born in Bruges in 1253, the second son of a wool broker who spent most of his life in the shadow of the Flemish textile trade without ever fully entering it. His father was a competent man, not a remarkable one. Willem decided early that he would not repeat that. By the time he was 20, he had apprenticed himself to a senior merchant in the guild and was learning not just the trade, but the architecture of it, the relationships, the debts, the favors, and the carefully cultivated trust that made one man's word worth more than another man's wax seal. He was good at all of it, extraordinarily good. By 30, he had his own trading operation. By 35, he had a seat on the guild council. By 40, his name was known in Venice and Paris and the wool markets of southern England. He imported raw Flemish wool, had it finished into cloth in the workshops along the Diva Canal, and sold the finished fabric across half of Europe at margins that made his competitors uncomfortable and his partners grateful. He had also, somewhere in the middle of building all of this, married Martha. Martha de Graef was the daughter of a Bruges linen merchant, educated by the nuns at the St. Clara Cloister, and possessed of a quality that Willem had immediately recognized and immediately underestimated: the ability to understand everything happening around her without giving any outward sign that she understood anything at all. She was quiet in a way that people mistook for passivity. She was still in a way that people mistook for contentment. She watched and she listened and she remembered, and she kept everything she knew in a place where no one could see it. They had one son, Thomas. Born in 1290 when Martha was 28 and Willem was 37, Willem loved the boy the way men of his class loved their sons, with a fierce pride that expressed itself mostly in expectation. Thomas would inherit the business. Thomas would carry the name. Thomas would be the thing that outlasted him. What Willem did not see, because he was not looking, was that Thomas watched his father with the same quiet, absorbing attention that he had inherited from his mother, and that Thomas was learning things about his father that a child should not have to learn. But in December of 1301, Thomas was 11 years old, and none of that had yet become the weight it would eventually become. What had become a weight, and a serious one, was the state of Willem's finances. Bruges in 1301 was a city riding the very peak of its commercial power, and peaks are dangerous places. The county of Flanders had been in a grinding political conflict with the French crown for years, a conflict that had disrupted trade routes, inflated the cost of everything from raw wool to finished cloth, and forced merchants to make decisions they would not have made in calmer times. Willem had made several of those decisions. He had extended credit to buyers who could not pay. He had signed contracts that locked him into prices that no longer made sense. He had borrowed to cover the gaps, and then borrowed again to cover the cost of the borrowing. By the autumn of 1301, Willem van Houten owed £200 of silver to a moneylender named Dirk Moens. The debt had been due in October. It had not been paid, and there was another obligation, less visible but more dangerous, that Willem had taken on without fully understanding what he was signing. A guarantorship on a separate debt, arranged by a man he trusted, for an amount that made the Moens debt look modest by comparison. He had been trying to find a way out of both for months. He had not found one. On the evening of December 3rd, 1301, Willem van Hout sat down at his writing table with a cup of wine, a candle, and a set of account books that contained no good news, and he tried to find a number that would give him a path forward. At some point during that evening, someone came through the back passage door of his house and ended his search permanently. The wine cup was still half full when Peter Klaas found it the next morning. He had not even finished his drink. Dirk Moens was 53 years old in December of 1301, and he was not a man you forgot once you had met him. He was broad across the chest and narrow around the eyes, with hands that looked like they had been built for a different, heavier kind of work than counting coins. He had grown up poor in the Zandstraat quarter, the son of a tanner whose workshop had failed when Dirk was 12, and he had spent the following 40 years making absolutely certain that he would never be poor again. He lent money. He collected it. He did not forget what was owed to him, and he did not forgive it either. His reputation in Bruges was built on one principle, known by everyone and spoken about only in careful terms. You paid what you owed to Dirk Moens, or something happened to you. Not always something violent. Sometimes just something unfortunate. A contract that fell through at the wrong moment. A business partner who suddenly became unavailable. A shipment that arrived damaged. Dirk Moens had a way of making the world become inconvenient for people who did not honor their obligations. When Peter Klaas came to Dirk's counting house on the morning of December 4th to inform him that Willem van Houte had been found dead, Dirk Moens received the news in silence. He folded his hands on the table. He expressed his condolences in language that was correct and completely empty. He asked no questions about how it had happened or when or who might have been involved. And then he said nothing about the 200 pounds of silver that Willem had owed him for 2 months. Peter noted this. He questioned Dirk twice in the days that followed. Both times, Dirk was cooperative and unhelpful in equal measure. He said he and Willem had reached a verbal agreement to extend the debt. He said there were no witnesses to this agreement. He said he considered the matter settled and had no intention of pursuing Willem's estate for the money. 200 pounds of silver, settled, verbally, with no witnesses, by a man who had never in his professional life settled anything for less than he was owed. Peter wrote this down. He did not yet know what it meant. He would not know for 31 years. Hugo de Wolf had been Willem van Houte's business partner for 11 years. He was 44 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that made people assume he was in charge of whatever room he entered. He was not stupid, far from it. He was careful and methodical and possessed of a patience that could easily be mistaken for calm, which was not the same thing at all. He and Willem had built their trading network together during the prosperous years of the late 1280s and 1290s, when Bruges was at the height of its power, and money moved through the city like water through the canals. They had complemented each other well in those years, Willem's gift for relationships and Dirk's eye for logistics, or rather, Hugo's eye for logistics, and Willem's gift for making the kind of friends who opened doors. Between them, they had constructed something genuinely impressive. But the last 2 years had changed things. The source of the fracture was a contract. A new trading arrangement with a Venetian merchant house called the Contarini family, who were interested in establishing a permanent supply line for finished Flemish cloth to the Italian market. Willem wanted to sign it. Hugo did not. Their reasons were financial on the surface and personal underneath, and neither of them had been honest with the other about which was which. What Hugo had not told Willem, and what no one else in Bruges knew except for one person, was that Hugo had already been approached by a competing Venetian house, the Dandolo family, and had been conducting quiet, preliminary conversations with them for 6 months. If Willem signed the Contarini contract, it would lock their operation into a relationship that would effectively block the Dandolo arrangement for years. Hugo had been trying to delay the Contarini decision long enough to bring the Dandolo talks to a conclusion. He had been doing this by raising objections, requesting additional reviews, and generally being the kind of business partner who slows things down without ever quite stopping them. Willem had grown frustrated. In November of 1301, he had told Hugo directly that he intended to sign the Contarini contract by the end of the year, regardless of Hugo's reservations. When Peter Klaas arrived at Hugo's door on the morning of December 4th, Hugo de Wolf was already awake, already dressed, and already standing at his writing table with a quill in his hand. The ink on the page in front of him was fresh. His right sleeve had a dark stain on it that he had clearly attempted to wash out at some earlier point. It had not come out completely. Hugo's explanation was immediate and detailed. He had been in his stable the previous evening, helping his stable hand with a horse that had cut its leg badly on a fence post. The stable hand, a man named Jan, could confirm it. His wife Lena had been in the stable for part of the time. A neighbor across the alley had heard the horse and could confirm the time. The stain was horse blood. He had tried to clean the sleeve before bed, but had not wanted to wake the household by calling for hot water. Peter Claes wrote all of this down. What he did not write down was the thing he noticed as Hugo was speaking. A small thing, the kind of thing that only reveals itself much later, when you are sitting somewhere quiet and going back through a day that did not make sense. Hugo de Wulf had answered the question about the stain before Peter had asked it. Peter had said only that he had news about Willem. He had not yet said anything about what he was looking at on Hugo's sleeve. But Hugo had already begun explaining it. Lena de Wulf was 39 years old, the same age as Martha van Houten, and the two women had known each other for the 11 years of their husband's partnership, without ever becoming close in any way that mattered. They were cordial. They attended the same guild dinners. They sat near each other in church on Sundays. They exchanged the kind of conversation that fills time between silences without leaving any trace. What Lena knew about that evening, what she had seen, what she had done, she kept entirely to herself. When investigators examined Hugo's stable, in the days after the murder, they found the horse with the injured leg. They found Jan, the stable hand, who confirmed the story without hesitation. They found the fence post with the blood on it. Everything Hugo had said was exactly as he had described. And in what they did not think to ask was whether someone had arranged for it to be exactly as described. There was someone else who heard about Willem's death that morning and was gone from Bruges before anyone thought to look for her. Her name was Cécile Fontaine. She was 29 years old, the daughter of a French cloth merchant named Armand Fontaine, who had established himself in Bruges 6 years earlier and built a small but respectable trading operation in the city. Cécile had been educated in Lyon and spoke 3 languages. She was unmarried, which was unusual for a woman of her age and background, and she moved through the commercial world of Bruges with a confidence that made people occasionally forget she was not supposed to be there at all. She had been seen in Willem's company on numerous occasions over the previous year, always in public, always in the context of business, always with a perfectly reasonable explanation. She was acting as a liaison for her father's operation, or discussing a potential contract, or attending a guild event as a guest of a mutual acquaintance. Martha van Houten had known who Cécile Fontaine was for 8 months. The letter had arrived in April of 1301. It had been sent from Ghent, where Cécile had travelled on family business, addressed to Willem at his counting house. It had been delivered to the wrong address, the house rather than the counting house, which shared a name on the same street, and had been signed for by a neighbour's servant before the error was noticed. The neighbour, a woman named Agnes, had opened it before realizing and had brought it to Martha directly, with apologies that were elaborate enough to make clear she had read most of it. Martha thanked her. She closed the door. She read it herself. It was not a business letter. She sat with it for a long time in the front room of her house, in the chair by the window where she usually did her accounts. The canal was visible through the glass, and she watched the water for a while without seeing it. Then she folded the letter very carefully, the way you fold something you intend to keep, and she put it inside the binding of the household account book that sat on the shelf above the fireplace, the one that no one ever opened except her. She told no one. She changed nothing in how she moved through her days. She sat beside Willem at guild dinners and asked about his business and listened to his answers. So she attended church with him on Sundays and stood at the correct distance and wore the correct expression. She managed the household and raised their son and gave no outward indication that anything was different. But she began, very quietly, to pay attention to different things than she had paid attention to before. She started to notice, for instance, that a man named Remy Fontaine, Cecile's older brother, who had been a peripheral figure in their social world for years, appeared in her husband's orbit with a frequency that she had not previously registered. He attended the same dinners. He was present at guild events. He had a habit of appearing at the counting house on afternoons when Willem was working late. And Willem, when Martha asked casually about him, described Remy as a useful contact, in a man with connections to the French wool market, nothing more than that. What she did not know yet, what she would piece together only much later, after Willem was dead and the account books were hers to examine without anyone looking over her shoulder, was exactly what kind of arrangement Remy Fontaine and Willem van Hout had between them. But she kept watching, and she kept the letter. Brother Anselm of the monastery of St. Donas was 60 years old in December of 1301, and he had been at the monastery for 37 years, since he was a novice of 23, who had arrived from a village outside Ghent with poor eyesight, excellent Latin, and a disposition so thoroughly unsuited to ordinary human company that the monastic life had seemed less a vocation than a relief. His official role was chronicler, and he maintained the monastery's record of city events, births, deaths, marriages, disputes, market prices, weather, crimes, the comings and goings of notable visitors, the minor catastrophes and occasional triumphs of a medieval city, going about its daily business. He had been doing this for 19 years, with a precision that made his manuscripts among the most accurate historical records in all of Flanders. Scholars from as far as Paris had written to request access to his work. He was not by nature a man who involved himself in things. He observed, he recorded. He maintained a careful distance from everything he documented, because that was how documentation worked. You wrote down what was true, not what you felt about it, and you kept yourself out of the record entirely. On the night of December 3rd, 1301, Brother Anselm was awake. He was almost always awake at that hour. He had suffered since his 40s from a condition that made sleep difficult and shallow. He would fall asleep easily enough, but wake in the early hours and find himself unable to return to it, his mind running over the entries he had made that day, the things he had seen, the small corrections he wanted to make to manuscripts already completed. On such nights he would rise, dress in his heaviest habit against the cold, and walk in the monastery's outer courtyard, which gave a view across the rooftops toward the canal and the merchant quarter beyond. He had been doing this for years. It was his private accommodation, with the fact that God had apparently not made him for rest. On the night of December 3rd, he was in the courtyard at approximately the second hour after midnight, what we would call roughly 2 in the morning, when he heard something, not loud, Not a shout or a crash or any of the sounds that the night sometimes produced from the direction of the taverns near the market. Something quieter, the sound of a door opening and closing carefully in the dark. He looked toward the Vollestraat, which was partially visible from his position at the eastern end of the courtyard, and he saw a figure moving along the side of the street in the shadow of the buildings, moving quickly and without a light. He recognized the figure. He stood very still, and the figure at the end of the street paused, turned, and looked directly at the courtyard where Brother Anselm was standing. They looked at each other across the dark and the distance, no words, no gesture, just the mutual acknowledgement of two people who both understood exactly what was passing between them in that moment. Then the figure turned and walked away into the night. Brother Anselm stood in the courtyard for a long time after that. The cold settled around him. Somewhere on the canal, a boat shifted against its moorings. He thought about what he had seen. He thought about what it meant. He thought about what a chronicler of truth was supposed to do with something like this. And then he went inside, took out a manuscript he had been working on, a record of grain prices in the autumn markets, tedious and precise, and the last thing anyone would pick up if they were looking for something interesting. And he wrote, what's in the outside margin of the third page, in a handwriting considerably smaller than his usual hand, in Latin, in a phrasing so compressed and so buried in abbreviations that it would have been nearly invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for it, what he had seen and who he had seen. He wrote the name, he wrote the time, he described the direction the figure had come from and the direction it had gone. And then he closed the manuscript, returned it to its place on the shelf among 200 others, and went to pray for a very long time in the chapel, asking for forgiveness for what he was about to not do. He never reported it. He never spoke of it to anyone. He kept his silence for 17 years until he died, and even then, on his deathbed, with the manuscript sitting in his hands and the name written in the margin 12 inches from his face, he gave it back without a word and let himself die with the secret sealed inside the binding. What stopped him was not loyalty. It was not affection for the figure he had seen. It was fear. The simple animal fear of a man who understood exactly what kind of person he was dealing with, and who had no illusions about what happened to people who spoke when they were supposed to stay silent. He was an old monk in a cold city with no family and no protector, and the figure he had seen in the Vollestraat had looked back at him with an expression that communicated, without requiring any words at all, that this was understood between them. Brother Anselm was a meticulous man. He documented everything. He documented his silence too, as in the only way available to him, in margins, in Latin, in a handwriting no one would read for 31 years. It was the most consequential thing he ever wrote. Thomas van Houte was 11 years old on the morning his father's body was found, and the first thing he understood, before the grief, before the fear, before any of the things an 11-year-old was supposed to feel, was that his mother was not surprised. He did not know how he knew this. He could not have explained it to anyone. She cried eventually when the officials came, and when the neighbors gathered, and when the guild members arrived in their formal robes with their formal expressions. She did everything correctly. She was a woman in grief, visible and appropriate and present in the way she was supposed to be. But Thomas watched her, the way he had always watched her, with the quiet, absorbing attention that was both their natures. And somewhere behind the performance, He could not find the shock that should have been there. He filed this away. Children do not have words for these things. They have feelings, and they carry the feelings forward into years and decades, and eventually into the adults they become, where the feelings sit like weights in a room they learned to navigate around. Thomas grew up in the house on Wollestraat with his mother and the account books and the portrait of his father that hung in the entrance hall. A formal, expensive thing, painted when Willem was 42 and had not yet started to carry his troubles in his face. He was educated by the guild scholars, and he learned the cloth trade by working alongside the men who had worked for his father and now worked for Marta, who ran the business with a quiet efficiency that surprised everyone who had assumed she knew nothing about it. He learned, as he grew older, that his father had owed money. He learned because Marta eventually told him that the business had been in worse shape than anyone outside the family had known. He learned that Hugo de Wolf had taken over the Venetian contracts, and that Dirk Moens had never collected what was owed, and that Cécile Fontaine had left Bruges in the winter of 1301 and had not come back. He did not learn who had killed his father. The investigation closed in the spring of 1302. The guild councils appointed merchants, too careful, methodical men named Peter van Acker and Thomas Cools, had questioned everyone they could think to question, had examined every piece of evidence they could identify, and had concluded with visible reluctance that the killer was almost certainly a person unknown, a traveler, a thief, someone who had moved through Bruges in December of 1301 and departed before anyone thought to look for them. The locked door remained their central problem. They had no explanation for it. The back passage, they noted, appeared to have been bolted from within as well, though the bolt on the back was less solid than the front and showed some signs of having been worked from the outside, perhaps with a tool. They noted this without being able to do anything with it. They had no tool. They had no tool marks precise enough to identify the method, and they had the observation, and they filed it, and they moved on. Hugo de Wolf, questioned 6 times over the winter, had an alibi that held at every point. The horse, the stable hand, the wife, the neighbor. Every element confirmed every other element with a consistency that Van Acker and Cools found somewhat unusual, but could not challenge without evidence they did not have. Dirk Moens was questioned twice and was helpful in a way that produced nothing. Cécile Fontaine had left Bruges on the morning of December 5th, the day after the body was discovered, and by the time investigators thought to look for her, she was already past Ghent. They sent inquiries. She responded through her father's factor with a brief statement saying she had been in the city on business, had heard of Heer van Hout's death with great sorrow, and had departed on a previously arranged schedule. She had not been aware she was required to remain. She was not required to remain. The investigators had no grounds to compel her. Her statement went into the file, and the file went onto a shelf, and the case went cold. Hugo de Wolf signed the Contarini contract 6 months after Willem's death, in June of 1302, having by then concluded his arrangement with the Dandelot family on terms that no longer conflicted with it. The Contarini contract was not particularly profitable. The Dandelot arrangement was considerably better. Hugo managed both with the patience and efficiency that had always been his strongest quality. He also, in those months, took over Willem's seat on the Guild Council, Willem's share of their joint trading operation, and Willem's largest existing contracts. All of this accomplished through a process that was entirely legal and entirely proper, and moved with a speed that people noticed and discussed and ultimately accepted because Hugo was there and Willem was not. Dirk Moens continued to lend money. He never mentioned the £200 again. His ledgers for 1301 show a debt in Willem's name marked in a notation that uses a word that appears nowhere else in any of his books, as resolved. His personal ledger for the same year, which survived in private family records and was not examined for over a century, shows a separate entry in different ink, made at a different time, for the same amount, marked paid, in cash, in the last week of January 1302, 6 weeks after Willem van Houte was murdered. And the name of the person who paid it is written in the same compressed, abbreviated hand as the main entry. And it is not Willem van Houte. But that ledger would not be found for a very long time. In 1318, Brother Anselm died in the infirmary of the monastery of Sint Donas, in the early morning hours before the first office, attended by 2 younger monks, who noted that he had spent the final nights of his life in a state of agitation that the prior ascribed to the natural distress of the dying. On the day before his death, he had asked that a specific manuscript be brought to his bed, a record of autumn grain prices from 1301, a document of no apparent significance to anyone. He had held it for several hours. He had not opened it as far as the monks could tell. He had simply held it, and at some point had fallen into sleep with it on his chest, and when he woke, he had handed it back and asked for water and not mentioned it again. He died the following morning before dawn. The manuscript was returned to its shelf by a novice who did not know what it was. It sat among 200 others in the scriptorium for 14 years without being opened. Thomas van Hout was not looking for a grain price record in the winter of 1332. He was 42 years old and had spent the previous 2 years conducting a systematic, private, and increasingly obsessive review of everything connected to his father's death. He had told no one what he was doing. His wife knew he was spending time in the city's records. His business partners knew he was distracted. No one knew why. What had started him was a conversation. A chance remark made at a guild dinner by an old merchant who had known Willem in the years before his death, who had drunk a little more wine than he intended and said something careless about how it was a terrible shame what had happened to Van Hout, especially given everything that was going on with the Fontaine business at the time, and had then looked immediately as though he wished he had not said it, and had changed the subject with the practiced speed of a man who had been keeping that particular thought in a locked box for 3 decades, and had just seen the key slip out. Thomas had not pressed him that evening. He had waited. He had thought about it for several weeks, and then he had quietly begun to go back through everything, the guild records, the trading accounts, the witness statements from the investigation, the notes made by Peter van Ecke and Thomas Koels in the winter of 1302, and filed away as a closed matter. He had spoken to old merchants, to former guild members, to the families of people who had known Willem in 1301. He had spent a great deal of time being very patient and asking questions that seemed to be about something else. And over those 2 years, one name had accumulated around itself a set of connections and coincidences and carefully explained absences that Thomas could not make add up to anything innocent, no matter how he arranged them. That name was Remy Fontaine, Cecile's older brother, the man who had appeared in Willem's orbit with gradually increasing frequency in the years before his death, and the man whose family connection to Cecile gave him a reason to be present in Willem's life that was personal rather than commercial, and who had used that reason with a discretion so complete that almost no one had thought to connect him to anything. The man who had been at the guild dinner 2 weeks before Willem's death and had sat next to him and appeared, by all accounts, entirely at ease. Thomas had been unable to find any record of Remy Fontaine in Bruges after January of 1302. He had simply ceased to appear in any document, guild records, tax rolls, property records, anything. He had not formally closed a business or sold a property or left any administrative trace of departure. He had simply stopped being in Bruges, the way a person stops being somewhere when they have a reason to leave quickly. Thomas came to the monastery of Saint Donaas in January of 1332 to look at the records from the autumn and winter of 1301. The guild records, the civic chronicles, the records of any official proceedings that might mention either Remy Fontaine or the circumstances around Willem's death. The prior gave him access to the scriptorium. A young monk named Bernard was assigned to help him find the relevant materials. It was Bernard who placed on the reading table, along with the materials Thomas had specifically requested, a stack of additional manuscripts from the same period, grain records, market records, the administrative minutiae of a medieval city going about its business, standard material for a researcher. Thomas worked through them methodically, making notes in the margin of his own paper, moving through each one with the focused patience that had characterized everything he did. He was on his third hour in the middle of a grain price record dated autumn 1301, when a page turned faster than he expected in a cold draught from the door, and he saw in the outer margin of the page opposite a line of writing that did not belong to the document. He leaned closer. The handwriting was smaller than the text around it, compressed into abbreviations, in a Latin that was precise and deliberate, and which he had to read twice before he was certain he understood what it said. He read it once. He closed the manuscript carefully, the way you close something you are not sure you should have opened. He sat in the cold scriptorium for a long time without moving. Bernard, the young monk, looked up from his own work twice and saw Thomas van Hout sitting completely still with his hands flat on the closed manuscript and his eyes focused on a point somewhere past the wall in front of him. He did not ask. The look on the man's face discouraged questions. What Brother Anselm had written 31 years earlier in the margin of a grain price record that no one had thought to read was this: on the night of the 3rd of December, in the 2nd hour past midnight, I observed from the east end of the outer courtyard a figure departing from the rear passage of the house belonging to Heer W. van Houten on the Wollestraat, moving south toward the Dever Canal. The figure carried a small light, which was extinguished upon reaching the end of the street. The figure turned at the canal and became aware of my presence, and we remained in observation of one another for a period I estimated no less than 1 paternoster, and no more than 3, after which the figure turned and departed south along the canal bank. I recognized the figure without uncertainty. I have not reported this observation and do not intend to do so, for reasons that will be clear to any reader of sufficient intelligence who knows what I know of this person. I record it here as the only form of testimony available to a man in my position. The name of the figure is R. Fontaine, cloth factor, residing at that time on the Genstraat, brother to C. Fontaine and known associate of the deceased. May God have mercy on both of us. The name in the margin was not Hugo de Wolf. It was not Dirk Moens. It was Remy Fontaine, Cecile's older brother, says the man who had introduced Willem to Cecile in the first place, who had been present in Willem's life for years as a peripheral, pleasant, entirely unremarkable figure, whose only notable characteristic, looking back, was that he was never quite at the center of anything, always adjacent, always available, never the subject of a question because he was never quite the subject of a conversation. What Thomas pieced together over the weeks that followed from the grain price manuscript and the guild records and the account books and the one conversation he finally had with his mother was this: Remy Fontaine had borrowed money, a significant amount, £300 of silver, drawn from Dirk Moons, for a commercial venture that had not succeeded. He had borrowed it not in his own name but through a set of arrangements that effectively concealed the debt from the guild's official records, which was itself a violation of guild statutes serious enough to result in expulsion. He had persuaded Willem, over the course of a friendship built on proximity and Cecile's involvement, to sign as guarantor on the underlying obligations, not the debt itself, which was private, but the commercial instruments that stood behind it. Willem had signed. He had not fully understood what he was signing. This was not an accident. By October of 1301, the venture had failed, the debt was due, and Dirk Moens was pressing for payment. Remy could not pay. If he could not pay and the guarantorship became visible, Willem would be liable. And Willem, examining his own accounts in the autumn of 1301, had finally understood what he had signed and what it meant, and had told Remy directly that he intended to bring the matter to the guild council and have the guarantorship dissolved through official process. This would have exposed Remy completely. The guild would have expelled him. The debt would have been his alone, and he could not pay it. And Dirk Moens was not the kind of man who allowed debts to remain unpaid. Remy had a key to Willem's house. He had had it for 2 years, given to him in a period of closer friendship, and never asked for back. He knew the layout of the rooms, the back passage, the bolt that could be worked from outside with a thin piece of iron if you knew where to apply pressure. He had been in that house at least a dozen times. He knew where Willem kept his accounts. He knew when Martha retired for the evening and that Willem often worked late. On the night of December 3rd, he had come to the house to find another way. What way he intended, or whether he intended anything specific at all when he came through that back passage door, is a question that died with him. What happened inside that room happened, and then he left the way he had come, and he locked the door behind him with the key he carried, and he walked south along the canal, and was observed by a monk in a courtyard who had the misfortune of not being able to sleep. He left Bruges quietly over the following weeks, without drama or announcement. He was in Paris by the spring of 1302. He built a life there, a new trading operation, a different set of contacts, a name he used differently in different contexts. He was careful. He was patient. He did not write to anyone in Bruges and did not return. He was 61 years old when Thomas finally found the name in the margin. Thomas brought the grain price manuscript to the Count of Flanders magistrate in Bruges, not the guild council, which had already closed the matter, but the civic magistrate, who had jurisdiction over criminal matters regardless of guild status. The magistrate read Brother Anselm's marginal notation with the expression of a man who was trying to decide whether he was reading something significant or something unfortunate, and concluded that it was probably both. He sent an official inquiry to Paris. It took 4 months for the response to arrive. Remy Fontaine had died in the winter of 1331, 12 months before Thomas found the note. 1 year, 12 months, and the distance between justice and the grave had been exactly 1 year. There was no trial. There was no confession. There was no public moment where the name was spoken in front of everyone who had spent 31 years in the shadow of not knowing. The magistrate recorded the finding, the manuscript, its provenance, the identity of the author, the nature of the testimony, and prepared a formal notation for the civic record. It would name Remy Fontaine. It would note the evidence. It would observe that the accused was deceased and that no legal proceedings were possible. Before he filed it, Thomas went home. He went to the house on Wollestraat, which was still his mother's house, where Martha van Houte was 70 years old and had lived for 31 years with a set of things she had not told anyone. And he sat across from her at the table in the front room, the same table where she had done her accounts for 3 decades, the same chair by the same window, looking out at the same canal. And he put the manuscript on the table between them without saying anything. She looked at it for a long time. Then she got up and went to the shelf above the fireplace, and she took down the household account book, the same one, the original, which she had kept for 30 years out of a stubbornness that she could not have fully explained. And she opened it to the back binding, and she removed 2 things that had been tucked inside it since 1301. The first was the letter from Cécile Fontaine to Willem. Thomas did not read it. She did not offer it. She set it on the table and folded her hands over it and left it there. And the second was a small piece of fabric, dark wool, heavy, cut roughly, not torn, but cut with something sharp. It was about the size of a hand, and it had been folded very precisely and kept flat inside the binding for 31 years. And it had retained its shape and its color and its texture with an almost unnerving completeness, as though it had been waiting. She had found it caught on the iron latch of the back passage door on the morning after Willem's death, before the investigators arrived, before anyone else had been through that part of the house. She had seen it, and she had recognized the color, because she had seen Remy Fontaine wearing a cloak of exactly that dark wool at a guild dinner 2 weeks before Willem died, and she had noticed the quality of it, the way she noticed the quality of cloth, because cloth was her world too. She had taken it. She had hidden it. She had told no one, because she was afraid of Remy Fontaine in exactly the way that Brother Anselm had been afraid of him, and because Thomas was 11 years old, and she had spent 31 years calculating every single day whether revealing what she suspected was worth the risk to her son. She had concluded 31 years ago that it was not, and then she had concluded it again the following year, and the year after that. And every year until Thomas sat across from her at the table with the monk's words in front of him, and she understood that the calculation had been made for her, finally, by a dead man's handwriting in a book that nobody read. Thomas looked at the piece of fabric for a long time. Then he said, "You kept this." And Martha said, "I kept this." And that was all they said for a while. The civic record was filed in the autumn of 1332. It named Remy Fontaine as the person responsible for the death of Willem van Hout on the night of December 3rd, 1301. It noted the evidence, the manuscript notation by Brother Anselm of St. Donas, the fabric fragment preserved by Martha van Houte, the testimony of Thomas van Hout regarding the financial circumstances, and it observed that the accused had died in Paris in the winter of 1331, 1 year prior to the discovery of the evidence against him, and that no criminal proceeding was therefore possible. It was, in the formal language of 14th century Flemish civic administration, as close to justice as the living could offer the dead. Pieter Claes heard about it from his granddaughter. He was 82 years old by then, when living in a small house off the Langestraat, with the failing eyesight and perfect memory that very old age sometimes produces, where the things you saw last week blur at the edges, but the things you saw 50 years ago are sharp and immediate and present as the morning light. His granddaughter, a girl of 17 named Els, who was the only member of his family who visited reliably, came to him on an afternoon in October and read him the civic record in its entirety, slowly, because his ears too were not what they had been. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He had thought about that morning on the Wollestraat hundreds of times over 31 years. Not obsessively. He was not that kind of man. But it had never fully settled. It had that particular quality of an incomplete thing, on the kind of case that leaves a small stone in the mind that you are always stepping around. He told Els about the morning they broke down the door. He told her about the wine cup, still half full, and about Martha's face, and about Hugo de Wolf answering the question before it was asked. And then he told her about the thing he had written down and then forgotten, the thing that had seemed meaningless in the moment and had never been connected to anything until now. Near the back passage door, on the floor of Willem's study, there had been a small pool of wax, not hardened like the candle wax on the table. That wax had been cold and set for hours by the time they arrived. This was different. This wax had still been slightly soft when Peter pressed it with his finger to test it. Recent, within a few hours, from a candle someone had carried in from outside. A candle that was not Willem's, whose candles were all burned to the base and cold. Someone had brought a light into that room in the night and had left wax on the floor near the door they had come in through and gone out of, and had locked the door behind them with a key they already had. Peter had written it down in his own notes that night. He had noted the wax, the temperature, the location. He had filed it. He had moved on to the next question, and the next one, and the next, and the note about the wax had sunk to the bottom of a pile of observations and had never risen again until his granddaughter read him the civic record 31 years later, and the stone in his mind finally settled. He told Els all of this. She wrote some of it down, because she was that kind of girl. She asked him what he thought about it. About the 31 years, about the case finally being recorded, even with no one left to punish for it. He said, "A name in a record is not nothing. A name attached permanently to what it did is not nothing." Then he was quiet again for a while, looking at a wall he could not quite see anymore, and then he said, "I should have looked more carefully at that wax." Remy Fontaine died in Paris in the winter of 1331, without ever being questioned about anything connected to Bruges or to Willem van Houte. He had lived for 30 years in a city that did not know him as anything other than a cloth factor of moderate success, a man of ordinary habits, a person who attended church and kept accounts and caused no notable trouble. He had outlived his sister. He had outlived Dirk Moens, who died in 1319. He had outlived Brother Anselm and Hugo de Wolf and Peter van Acker and Thomas Koels, who had conducted the investigation that never found him. He had not outlived the manuscript. The one thing he could not control was a man who could not sleep, walking alone in a cold courtyard at 2 in the morning, watching the shadows on the canal, who had the habit of recording everything and the discipline to record even the things he was afraid to say aloud, who had understood that silence was the only way to survive and had found in the margins of a grain price record the only form of testimony left to him. He had not outlived that. Before you go, this case left behind 8 people, and any one of them could be the answer to the question this case deserves to end with. Willem, whose secrets created the conditions for his own death. Marta, who knew more than she told anyone and kept a piece of fabric for 31 years in the back of an account book and called that protection and was not entirely wrong. Hugo, who answered the question before it was asked, and whose alibi was confirmed by everyone connected to him, and who benefited from Willem's death more than any other person except the man who committed it. Dirk, who forgave a debt that Dirk Moons did not forgive debts, and whose private ledger showed a payment made 6 weeks after the murder by a name that was not Willem van Hout's. Cecile, who loved a man who could not love her without cost, and who left Bruges the morning after his body was found and never came back, and whose grief, if it was grief, she carried alone to wherever she went. Lena, who washed the sleeve before anyone could examine it, and who may have known exactly what she was washing and may have known nothing at all, and whose silence on the matter was complete. Peter, who noticed the wax on the floor and wrote it down and forgot it for 31 years, and who lived long enough to hear the answer and to understand, finally, what the wax had meant. And Brother Anselm, who saw everything and was afraid and wrote it down anyway in the smallest handwriting he could manage, in the margins of a document about grain prices, in the only way available to a man in his position. 7 people, 1 locked door, 31 years. Here is the question. Who was the most important person in solving this case? Not the killer, not even the victim, the person whose action, or inaction, or fear, nor small careful Latin in a margin, made it possible for the truth to finally exist somewhere outside of one person's knowledge. Leave your answer in the comments, because after everything you just heard, I am genuinely uncertain of the answer myself. And I think that is the only honest way to end a case like this one.